Welcome to another day of Bible study. So glad that you are back with us this morning as we continue on through another day of the Whole50 Bible study. We are one day away from now being exactly halfway through the Bible study. And today our topic is from 1 Samuel chapter 3. We're actually continuing on from yesterday's reading, which may be the only time in the study where we back to back two passages, but I can't quite recall. But this one was just too good. Couldn't fit it all in one day. And so we continue on in our study about young Samuel as we complete the second half of the chapter 3 in 1 Samuel. And I've entitled this one Dysfunctional Family, which perhaps many of us who are watching understand what dysfunctional family means. And if you don't understand what dysfunctional family means, it's probably because you're the dysfunctional family. No, maybe a little too early in the morning, right, for us. But that is our topic for today. And I just want to remind you, if you've not done this yet, please take the opportunity to go out to christtable.today, sign up on our email list. I actually have a great story that I'm going to send out. I may send out a couple of emails. I'm not sure, but I'm going to send out a great story this week from someone who had an interaction with their college-age grandson that I think you're gonna appreciate. But also, I want to make sure that you're able to get a copy of this Party On, which is our next Bible study, going to start here in a few weeks. Going to start mailing them out really soon, and want to make sure that you're on the list. And anybody who donates in the month of April to Christ Table, you're going to get one of these absolutely free for no matter what you donate. If you are unable to make a financial contribution right now, you can still participate in the Bible studies here with us online. And if you actually want a copy of the study itself, then just let me know and we'll make sure to get one to you. So why don't we just go ahead and jump into our reading today. In fact, I'm going to begin with the last verse from yesterday's reading, verse 11. Remember, the Lord speaking to Samuel called out his name 3 times in the middle of the night. Samuel thought that it was Eli, the high priest, calling. Each time he goes out to Eli, the high priest, and says, "Yeah, what do you want?" Eli says, "It wasn't me." And finally, Eli says, "It must be God who's trying to speak to you. So next time, just say, 'Yes, Lord.'" And so the Lord speaks to Samuel and says, "I am about to do a shocking thing in Israel." And now we get to find out what that shocking thing is. "I'm going to carry out all of my threats against Eli and his family from beginning to end." Now, perhaps this is why Eli understood that it was God who was calling out to Samuel, is because it had been prophesied that Eli and his family were going to suffer because of the ways in which they were treating the people, but maybe even more importantly, the ways in which they were leading. And God does seem in Scripture to hold his leaders to a higher standard. Certainly, pastors, priests, kings, clergy, leaders are, we're all human. They're all human with the same struggles, with the same propensity to struggle and even to stumble as you and I. But God also seems to indicate, if you are going to step forward and lead my people, you need to have the capacity to live more out of my spirit than you do out of your flesh. And whenever you make mistakes that affect you, that's one thing. But as a leader, especially a leader in God's kingdom, whenever we make mistakes that lead other people astray along with us, God has zero level of tolerance for that kind of thing. And so Eli and his sons had been acting abhorrently, especially Eli's sons. And many of you know and understand what it's like to have a child who's gone astray and to do everything that you can in order to try to bring them back to the right path. That's not necessarily the story that's going on here. First, Eli's 2 sons were also priests. And so they weren't just Eli's sons. They also were being supervised professionally as priests of God by Eli. And so they're kind of in a family business, but the family business isn't Eli's business. The family business is God's business, his temple. And so Eli's sons have been abusing their role as priests. We know stories and maybe even faces and names of individuals who have abused their roles as priests, as clergy people. For one thing, they had been taking advantage of women who came to the temple. And so they had used their position of power. There was a power differential. They'd used their position of power in order to bed many of the women. And so, huge problem, right? Taking advantage of others, especially taking advantage of women as a clergyman. That's not, it's not going to go well with God. But then they were also just, and you should have known this by taking advantage of women, right? Someone who's going to do something like that is going to have issues in other areas of their life. But they were also just selfish. Part of the temple system is that people would bring sacrifices to God. Those sacrifices, though, weren't for nothing. Those sacrifices, actually, the food, the animals that they brought for sacrifice actually fed the temple workers, of which there were more than just Eli and his sons. There was Samuel. There would have been perhaps other priests, but there was also the Levites, the musicians. And so you've got those people who need to be fed, but then also these were meant to feed the poor, people in the community who could not feed themselves or who were struggling. These sacrifices that were made and the food and things that were brought to the temple to give to God, the storehouse, the tithe, was also to help feed those who were in need. And Eli's sons, these two priests, are said to have taken the best choice of meats. They were helping themselves first and also helping themselves to the best, which is a huge character flaw. And there were likely many, many other issues, not the least of which is that Eli knew these things were going on and just didn't do anything about it, didn't control it, had either essentially given up trying to do anything about it, or just didn't want to go through the hassle with his sons. Maybe he didn't care. I don't think it's that he didn't care. Eli seems like a nice old man, but he seems like a nice old man who's allowing the people to be taken advantage of by his sons. And he could have done something about it, and he should have done something about it, but he didn't. And because of that, he's now crossed the line with God. So God says, I'm going to carry out all of my threats against Eli and his family from the beginning to the end. Everything that I've said I'm going to do, Samuel, I'm going to carry out those threats. And Samuel, as a kid, is like, this is way too much for me, God. Why are you telling me these things? You should really go talk to your counselor, God. You should really go maybe and spend some time with your therapist. This isn't news that an ancient deity should be putting on the back of a young guy like me. God says, yeah, I know, Samuel, but I've warned him that judgment is coming upon his family forever because his sons are blaspheming God and he hasn't disciplined them. So I've vowed that the sins of Eli and his sons will never be forgiven by sacrifices or offerings. It's too late. If Eli and his sons were to go out and were to offer a sacrifice or something out there, it's too late. Punishment, discipline's going to have to come, and David writes this in Psalm 51, that you don't want sacrifices, you want a broken and contrite heart. And I think that that's essentially what's going on here. It's not as though the sacrifices have no effect. It's that at this point they've gone too far. Their hearts have become too hardened. There has to be some punishment. There has to be some discipline for what has gone on. These things can't just be swept under the rug. Too many people have been hurt. So Samuel stays in bed until morning. Likely would have needed to have gotten up earlier. in order to fulfill his duties before the beginning of the day. But Samuel sleeps in, and probably, I don't know that he got any sleep that night. It just says he stayed in bed until morning. These were some weighty things that God had told him. Then he gets up, he opens the doors to the tabernacle as usual, because he was afraid to tell Eli what the Lord had said to him. But Eli calls out, "Samuel, my son." "Here I am," Samuel replied. "What did the Lord say to you? Tell me everything." Samuel's like, "Do I really have to? And may God strike you and even kill you if you hide anything from me." It seems a little over the top, Eli. I think Eli knew that the conversation was about him. And I think he wanted to give Samuel permission to tell him. Maybe not, though. Maybe there are other readings to this. Maybe Eli is a hardened man who wants what he wants when he wants it. And this was what he wanted in that moment, was to hear what God had said. I tend to take the alternate view that Eli had essentially just given up, but at his core was a good person. You may determine how you wish. So Samuel told Eli everything, and he didn't hold anything back. Eli takes a deep breath and says, "It is the Lord's will. Let him do what he thinks is best." And as Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and everything that Samuel said proved to be reliable. The words that are used here in Hebrew are that nothing that he said fell to the ground. Falling to the ground means that you would hold on to the prophecies, the predictions that were true, and anything that was found not to be true, you'd just let fall to the ground. In other cultures and societies in that time, prophets sometimes would be right and sometimes would be wrong. They'd predict rain, and sometimes rain would come, and sometimes rain would not come. Sometimes they'd predict the surmounting of an enemy in a battle, and it would happen, and they would win, and sometimes they would lose. But God said for his prophets, for his mouthpieces, that nothing that they said would fall to the ground, that everything that they said would come true. And if something that a prophet said did not come true, then that would be an indication that that prophet was not a prophet of God, was not God's mouthpiece, and should be stoned. And so there were very harsh punishments for anyone who claimed to be a prophet, who claimed to be the voice of God, but then prophesied something that did not come true. And so what this verse is saying here is that God was with Samuel, which means that everything that Samuel said, God did not allow to fall to the ground, that God did everything that Samuel prophesied, which is a bit of an odd way of saying it, because you might say, or you might wish it to say, that Samuel did or prophesied everything that God said. But it kind of indicates a little bit of a different twist here, in that everything that Samuel says as prophet, God does, because of God's respect in a way for Samuel as prophet. I think that for us, there's a lot to be said there. And we see that actually in other places in Scripture where God bends his will at the prayers and requests of righteous people. We saw that with Abram when he argues with God over Sodom and Gomorrah. In fact, I'm writing a little bit about Sodom and Gomorrah in the next Bible study, the Party On Bible study. And so that was kind of why I was on with mine. But God kind of talks, Abram kind of talks God down. If you find 50 people, if you find 40 people, if you find 20 people who are righteous, well, what if there are only 10? And God bends his will to Abraham because of his respect to Abraham. It happens to Moses too. God's going to, at Sinai and the golden calf, God's going to completely wipe out the children of Israel. Moses talks him out of it. And here we kind of get that same impression that someone whom is righteous and who follows God, God seems to indicate that he will listen to them and hear what they say and do what they say, which I think doesn't necessarily imply that we're leading God, but that there's a heart that's so in tune with God that the individual, the human, the mortal, doesn't request something that God doesn't want to do, or that isn't in the heart or the direction that God is running in. And so just kind of love the way that's written here, that everything from here on that Samuel says doesn't fall to the ground or proves to be reliable or prophetically comes true. And Samuel is an important figure. He's at that transition between the time of the judges, Deborah, Samson, Gideon, into the time of the kings, Saul, David. In fact, he is right there, boots on the ground at the choosing of Saul. The first king, he's right there, boots on the ground at the choosing of David. The second king, extremely important figure. And the same is said of him, that his words don't fall to the ground. That was said of Elijah, one of, if not the greatest prophet that's on record in the Old Testament for Israel. So there you go. There's today's Bible study. A couple of things that came out of this as I'm thinking. First, God speaks here to Samuel both to inform and to invite him into a deeper relationship. I think we see that because God continues to reach out to Samuel. Samuel. And then finally, when Samuel says, hey, I'm here, I'm listening, God then walks him into a deeper relationship of knowledge and understanding, but also a closer relationship with him when it talks about his words being reliable and not falling to the ground. That's a deeper relationship. And so you sense this friendship almost that begins to develop right here and continues on between Samuel and God. I think that applies to us as well, that God speaks to us not to just inform us, but to invite us into a deeper and deeper relationship. Or you could switch that around and say that God speaks not just to invite us into a deeper relationship, but also to inform us. Because depending on your theology and your history and what you expect or desire from God, you probably only think of one of those two things, that God speaks to tell you what to do, right or wrong, but you don't think about God speaking to you in order to invite you to go into the depths of a relationship with him. Or if you're on the other side of things, I don't know, maybe charismatic Pentecostal, where you're more in touch with a deeper relationship with God, or that's just where you are, as it's about a relationship with you. Maybe you don't think about the fact that God also speaks not just because he wants to be your friend, but also to give boundaries, to inform you, to give you knowledge. And so that's the first thing. The second thing that I think of, and then we'll end here, is that God speaks both to inform us and to form us, both for information and for formation. And so that's really just a second step beyond what I just said, is that God speaks not just to inform you as well as to invite you into a deeper relationship, but God actually intends with how he speaks to us to inform you and to form you. And so how does God speak to us? Well, God speaks to us through the Spirit, through the conscience. God speaks to us through his word. There are moments I do believe God speaks to us audibly, through shouting, through a still small whisper. God speaks to us through the circumstances of life in which we find ourselves. God speaks to us oftentimes through other people. So there are many ways in which God speaks, but I believe that God still speaks, that his revelation and his desire and ability to speak to us did not end with revelation, that it's not closed, that God does still speak, and that The intent and the desire of God in his speaking to you is to inform you, to guide you, but also to form you, to mold you and I. Well, that's it for Samuel. So tomorrow we will be off and running somewhere else. Don't forget, head over to christtable.today. Make sure, because we're getting close to throwing these into the mail to you, make sure that you've donated if you want one and want to continue on with us in our next study about food. What's more enjoyable than food? Maybe it's just because I grew up Baptist with lots of potlucks and lots of food everywhere. But what's more enjoyable than food, feasts, fellowship, and a whole lot of fun in the Bible? And that's where we're going to spend our time. And make sure also that you sign up if you've not already for the email list. But until tomorrow, happy reading.